Welcome back to the channel, guys. Today we're going to be doing a tier list of my favorite fighting school manhwa. This one really follows those where there's a little bit more storyline happening in the school. So there's no God of High School on this because it literally has nothing to do with school-related fights. There are some interesting ones on this list, so do stay tuned. Please like and subscribe to the channel, guys. I really do appreciate you guys. And also check out the new episode of our podcast that just posted. The video links are down below for the podcast as well. Let's jump right into the video. Alright guys, so you see there aren't that many manhwa on this list, but I wanted to limit it to ones that are not in the F and further tier, simply because it's a waste of your time and I don't think that it's really worth it, but there are definitely other fighting manhwa, and some of them are in the F rank, and I'm sure I'm forgetting some super famous ones that I'm going to get called out on it down below. Doesn't mean I haven't read it, but it can mean that I'm forgetting it, unfortunately, because I don't have all these manhwa written down somewhere, unfortunately. I'm going to be going through these and ranking them from S to D, and the S ranks are going to be the ones I recommend the most that I think are overall strong story, great school fights, and really live up to that school environment expectations. Is there something interesting happening in the school dynamic that's really good? Because some manhwa start out about school and just don't go anywhere at all outside of that. D is going to be those that fail completely at pretty much everything of it, or at least are delivering low quality in multiple categories, and the A, B, and C will be somewhere in the middle of that. Let's go for it. Alright, and we're starting off with Dice. Okay, Dice follows main character that gets basically this dicing ability that allows him to shake up his life a little bit. The fighting in this manhwa is not always present, but what I will say is the fighting is quite enjoyable. Particularly because there's a feeling of desperation sometimes in the story. A lot of these stories have these characters that were bullied, that are forced to find a solution outside of their bullying, but this one finds a solution through something that's related to gambling, and it's rather interesting. If you haven't checked it out, it's definitely worth checking out. So, Dice. I'm going to say, from a fighting manhwa standpoint, it's not the strongest fighting manhwa there. It does have a really interesting system going on, though. And the interpersonal relationships between the characters are pretty good, while the art style, I think, is kind of mid. It's not the best out there. So, I'm going to say, in a lot of ways, it's a mid-series. I'm going to put it B, and when I say mid, I don't mean like it's very buh. It's actually still quite good, middle of the range right here. I think it's worthy of the B. Mercenary Enrolment. Mercenary Enrolment pretty much only spends its first arc really in school. School is always present throughout the story, but it's that first arc of beating down the bullies, and it was majestic. Unlike a lot of the stories on this list, the main character of this one isn't someone that gets bullied, but rather someone that gets even with bullies right from the beginning. There's no power-up, there's no necessity, and there's also just a general OP-ness about the protagonist. He never really struggles ever in this entire series so far. Even most recent chapter, he's been wrecking face and not really being challenged. Everyone's out of breath, and he's not even out of breath after beating 100 people. But, that being said, as a storyline perspective, I think there's a lot of subtle storytelling taking place in Mercenary Enrolment that I think is fantastic. Every little moment you see him smile is magical, and his relationship with his sister and grandfather are really endearing. The potential love interests are kind of unimportant. They're more there to create potential people for him to protect. And from a fighting perspective, I think it's really good. Art style-wise, I think it's weak in some cases. I think it goes from having a pretty solid, let's say, A-tier art style to sometimes dropping to C-tier for short periods of time. That being said, it's in its own style, so I don't hate it even when it drops out. And I'm not talking about like the chibi modes or stuff like that. I think those are different. I don't ever evaluate on that basis, but sometimes you can see like, ooh, there's a lot less lineage going on, a lot less detail on the page, sometimes for artistic effect, sometimes I feel it's just dropping off in quality. I think overall, though, among the fighting manhwa that have school related, I'm going to put this one in the S tier. Literally, I said in the beginning, if it isn't more about school, but they do manage to keep school involved in this the whole way through. his school life is something that clashes with his other things. His friends from school are very important to the story, and so and so. Guard Pass. Guard and Pass, jiu-jitsu fighting story, all about finding out who's behind a brutal beatdown of a main girl protagonist. It has some interesting emotional connections with this girl and what she's gone through and how it affects the protagonist, and how he basically goes from being a very average-looking gentleman to being a very good-looking bro with some physical attributes that are rather impressive. He's not a master, and this is what I really appreciate about the series. It's not like he's like, you study for 3 months, you are now the best in the world. It doesn't sell you that. It sells you the fact that he's learning, but he's not quite there yet. Some strong storytelling so far. It's still pretty early on, I think, overall in the story, so I'm reluctant to put it too high up there because it still has the potential to drop off. Whereas these other stories, either like in the case of Dice, it's a finished series. In the case of Mercenary Enrolment, we've had a lot of chapters to figure out what's going on. I'm going to put Guard Pass around B. This is, again, simply because it could royally drop the ball depending on the situation. All right, next we have Questism and Reality Quest. Both of these have a pretty similar background. Both characters are these bullied, rejected kids that are stuck serving the bullies of their school to be shuttles for whatever. One's for games and one's for food, I think. And both of them, in both of these cases, get a quest system. And I think that it is kind of brilliant. So I really like these two manhwa. I think they're a lot of fun, and I think they're both... One's a bit darker, to be honest with you. I think Reality Quest is a little bit darker and a bit more gory in its setup, whereas Quest Supremacy, I think, is a little bit more on the... not just the pure fighting side, but also how do you build relationships. Though there is that fair share in Reality Quest as well. Though I think it goes a bit gory. Okay, concept-wise. Main character is getting bullied. Main character gets a system where there's quests that if he accomplishes them, he'll get an ability or a perk. This perk could be ridiculous. Like the ability to scream really loudly in one case. Or the ability to throw a really good jab all of a sudden. And it changes their lot in life a little bit because it builds... Some of these quests are things like, kiss this girl. And that's not going to happen in a normal way, but they manage to find a way to not make it super creepy at the same time. Okay, because of their fun level, I think they're both really good at developing a character that changes over time. This ability to build on the character's abilities with these different quests really, for me, works 100%. And I think I've enjoyed the ride of both of them. And I'm going to put Questism as well as Reality Quest in the A tier. Because I think from a pure school life, really killing it. The fight-related stuff works for me 100%. I like both the gorier side and I like more the matchmaking side at the same time. And I think that they've come up with some clever ways to do things. However, I will say that if you read through one of them, you might feel like, ooh, this is a little repetitive by reading the other one. That being said, both worth looking at. All right, Lookism. Lookism. Oh my god, you guys love this one like crazy. It took me forever to get through it. There are things I still deeply dislike about this manhwa. I think it has a really tough start to get into. I think once you get into it, though, you start caring about the characters quite a bit. You like the protagonist and what he's going through. Quite a bit of micro stories going on in this one with the ensemble cast and everything going on. I think they've done a really good job at building this, and it continues to pop out really interesting characters. Example is Manager Kim, a professor that in this school ends up being not a professor, but anyway, Manager Kim ends up showing up in his own series that's freaking badass as well. And I'm kind of hoping we see even more spin-offs from Lookism, because if they're that good, my lord, we're in for an amazing thing. The art style is really cool and kind of unique. Characters are very identifiable by their nationality, which is not something you can see in a lot of series other than Windbreaker, for example. And yeah, I think I'm going to put it in the S tier in this case. I think in the overall, I put it in the A tier. But I think when it comes to school fighting manhwa, it's about as good as it gets. I don't think there's much stuff out there that's as good as this. Just a disclaimer on the Windbreaker side, I didn't put it in this list despite there being, you could argue that there could be considered fighting with the way they race, but I didn't want to, that would be more for a slice of life mono I'd want to put there, or a sports mono tier list, so I didn't put it on this list. But if it was here, it would be an S tier 100%. Alright, Noblesse. Noblesse looks like a vampire series, but it's actually a school fight series. Though, I think you could argue that it's a school and it's a fight series, but it's not a school fight series because the people they're fighting are not in the school, but the school often finds itself under attack, particularly early on in the storyline. And they all end up working at the school in one way or another. So Noblesse suffers from a couple of things. One is, ironically, the school part of the story is probably the least engaging part of it. I think that it has interesting art style, very pretty characters, some really cool powers, and it's a generally fun ride. But for me, it doesn't quite work. As a whole, I think it's just should have leaned more on one of the two, either accepted that it was a school slice of life series or been a full vampire series, but I really find that it suffers for it. For that reason, I can't put it too low nonetheless, because it has some great storytelling, but this is the struggle of doing these lists, because as I'm saying these things, I'm reminded of Raziel pretty much changing so little during the story. And he's this badass character that wants to live a normal life, but he's just that. He never goes beyond that. I'm gonna leave it in the B tier. I still think it's a great series. I think it's everyone should give it a read. But tell me if you recognize the problems of Noblesse that I'm mentioning about. Like the stagnation a little bit of Raziel. I think he's one of the coolest characters when it comes to his power set. But his attitude actually got kind of annoying to me after a while. This hyper silence and his just reality of him being around other people. I don't know. Okay. Viral hit or how to fight, depending on where you've read it and how you like it. Viral hit has a really cool concept. I really like it. Viral hit follows like school fighting manhwa, characters getting bullied. They basically release this video on YouTube of this fight, and things go nuts after that. And now there's basically this fighting situation where people are filming their fights more and more, and they're trying to become these viral hits, hence the fight. And the main character is this guy that ends up fighting against a bunch of different dudes. It's very, very good. The fighting is really on point. The storyline is really only there to hold the fights together. I can't deny that. But when the fights are this strong, it's fantastic. I have to put it in the A tier. I don't think I'll quite put it in the S tier, because I do think that it struggles from being very fright driven rather than the rest of it quite landing for me. Okay, Unordinary. So Unordinary is a funny story. Unordinary, school-based, magic abilities. Its art style is kind of painful to read now. I think that the relationships between the characters are really good in the story. I think it's a generally good one, but it's one of those stories that suffers from age, unfortunately. It's one that has been going on for a long time, and those that like it really like it. Like, they cannot turn away from it. I've dropped it a while back just because I found that the story is very slow moving to me, and I just found that, I don't know, like, I can't even say slow moving. It's not quite true. It just it feels like the pacing is just not a modern story, is what I should say. There's the stuff that does go on doesn't grab my attention enough, and the things that have not gone on have frustrated me a little bit. So I'm going to drop this down into the C tier. This is not saying these are bad series. None of these are bad series. None of them would I say are not worth reading. But I think of the group, I'm going to put it in the C tier. Okay, study group. Study Group's a fun series again. I think the fights are solid. I think the backbone of the story is kind of good. I think... Okay, so think with me a little bit. So Study Group, main character is getting tutored, ends up going to the same school as the girl that was tutoring him, that becomes his teacher. He decides to fight to protect her, and they form this study group basically where they will be able to learn, but also there's this fighting angle to the story because there's these bullies that are always ever present in the surrounding environment. When there is fights, well, the fights are fantastic. The main female character is where a lot of the story development takes place, that teacher and her story around this. And I'm not a huge fan of her. Maybe I'm alone on this. Tell me what you think about it. Main protagonist is kind of a blank slate character that is hyper studious, but also a really good fighter, obsessed with Bruce Lee. Really cool, great fights, but again, story-wise, I don't think it's that great story-wise. I'm gonna drop it in the B tier. Yeah, I think that the fights are good, but I don't think they're quite as good as some of these other series. And the premise of the story, while interesting, I don't think quite delivers as much as it should. All right, Supernova. Supernova has great visuals, solid fights, spends a good amount of time in school nonetheless. Another bully beatdown kind of story, at least at its start. And there's a mystical side to this where the main character is basically trained, air quote, powered up, trained by this ancient warlord that is able to make him stronger in a different scenario. And it's good. It's a solid series. It's also... I thought it had finished, but apparently it was only on hiatus, which is good because like it had just like gone on hiatus on a random chapter for some unforeseen reason. I think it's good. I don't think it's top tier. I'm gonna drop it into the C tier with Unordinary. I think it suffers from some of the same things, but I still think it's really good. Visually, it's a lot prettier at least. God of Blackfield. Ooh, God of Blackfield. Story I had dropped, I mentioned it before, but story I had dropped originally because I heard about who the villain was in the second arc, blah, 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 whatever. Main character is betrayed. He's a soldier in the French Legion, and he ends up being reincarnated in the body of a Korean teenager that was on the brink of ending his own life. And as a series, that's a pretty good premise. You have a soldier reborn into a Korean body. Right away, you're going to find a lot of similarities between God of Blackfield and Mercenary Enrolment. If you're not reading one, you should probably read the other. And if you really like one, you're going to probably love the other. Because they're both hyper-trained professionals put into a normal situation, facing against people that they are way better than. And it creates some good stuff. What I do like about both of them is they do deal with the lives of both of them. The background lives, the ones that they had before they ended up in their current school situation. And God of Blackfield jumps into it a little bit faster than Mercenary Enrolment does. Mercenary Enrolment only started doing it a little while back. They'll sprinkle it in here and there, but like the more real-life background only started recently. God of Blackfield is more visceral, in my opinion. It's the main character doesn't have the same types of limitations on himself as Ijin does. He also talks a lot more. Ijin is the quiet protagonist that says very little, whereas Kang in God of Blackfield definitely speaks his mind, and it's good. It's what he says is on point. I think God of Blackfield deserves to be in the S tier of the fighting school genre. It's among the best, and I have no issue putting it here. I think it's a fair ranking. Okay, Boston School. Okay, Boston School is from the same artist as the guy that did Rooftop Swordsmaster. One thing he's exceptionally good at is fighting manhwa. He's really good at drawing fights, making them really visceral, and again, these are stories that go fight to fight to fight to fight, mostly. The storyline is just there to basically these thin little threads that lead us between fights. That being said, this is a ranking of school fight manhwa. So when it comes to delivering on the fight angle, honestly, it's probably in the S tier when it comes to delivering on the fights. From a storyline perspective, not so much. Pretty straightforward. Just one of those characters that ends up like kind of detestable characters that ends up being this brutal protagonist that just goes from fight to fight beating everyone's ass. Most of the time pretty easily, but there's some really rough fights later on in this one. And there's not so much a supernatural angle, but like there's definitely a unique angle to this series once you get into it a little bit further. It's not as simple as it seems. So there are some interesting twists. The only thing is I don't think the twists are particularly well written. Okay. Fights are S tier. Story I would put in the D tier. And overall enjoyment for the series, for me, the art doesn't land. It doesn't work for me, nor does it work Rooftop Swordsman, because I find there's a lot of body deformity going on, like in regards to sizing, proportions, and stuff like that. And it's not quite working for me most of the time. I'm going to put it in the C tier. That being said, if you're looking for a pure fight manhwa, go for it. It's a lot of fun. Absolutely. Next, we have Weak Hero. Weak Hero is, for me, it's a bit of a story with a lot of promise, but didn't quite deliver on the potential that it had. There's some really good fights in this story. I think there's also really good storytelling in play. And I'm going to give it a lot of points. I'm going to give it a lot of points for that storytelling, actually, because you're either good at one or you're good at the other. The fights are pretty good. They're not as good as some of the other ones in the story, but where the story goes later in the story, there's some decisions that are made and character motivations that I'm just not into, but it's a fun ride nonetheless. I'm going to shove it in the B tier. Tell me if you disagree. Like, Weak Hero is an interesting one because I know it has its fan base, but not sure, man. Not sure. All right, we have Second Life of a Gangster. Very weak. I mentioned before, love me some gangster manhwa, some solid stuff. This one follows protagonist that becomes like a gangster again, leading his school group of gangsters this time. Kind of a brutal badass in his previous life, and this time he's gonna live a different life, but it's kind of the same life again. It creates some interesting situation, and it has a protagonist that's both likable and deeply dislikable at the same time. Because of that, I think storyline-wise, it builds some interesting dynamics between the characters. It has some really good fighting moments as well. And I'm just weak to seeing people like rise up and resurrect the gangsters. It's on point for me. It works for me. I'm giving it an A. The story works for me. The character works for me. I've had a lot of fun with it. Pounding is an interesting one. Unlike other series on this list, this one actually delves into the psychological a little bit. Although Dice does as well. The psychological side I'm referring to is just the main character is on the edge of misery. He's unhappy and he goes to the most extreme scenarios. And what saves him is another version of himself. He has a secondary personality, or what I'll say is like kind of a split personality of something created to protect him. Something we've seen in stories a lot. But this is interesting because it puts him in situations where he wouldn't have done certain things, and now some people are scared of him in some situations. He gets to get back at some of the people that hurt him, but the main character is still this kind individual, and it's this struggle of himself against himself, and I think Pounding is really good at it. I don't think it lands at all, but I think Pounding has some amazing fights, great dark atmosphere, though I will say that because of really the dark coloring of this series, and a lot of it happening at night, I find that sometimes it can get a little tiring to read, but this is a nitpick. It's really good. Check it out. I'm going to put it in the A tier, Pounding. Also, finished manhwa. Check it out. All right. The Breaker and maybe a bit of the Breaker New Waves. After that, it really becomes a series that's more about what happens outside of school, though school is always tangential to the series. And even in the original, school is already a little bit of a background. But there's definitely some fights in the school and some bully beatdown, same principle. But we've got some amazing fight choreography in this manhwa. There's a reason this is my favorite manhwa of all time, and that's simply for the fight choreography as well as some of the storytelling beats. The things that happen with the teacher in this case, I'll call him the teacher. He's not quite exactly a teacher, but he plays one for a little bit. Are great, where the main protagonist, Shiwon, goes from being the weak hero to being this extremely strong character later on that can face any adversity and overcome it is brilliant and fantastic, and I love it to death. You know I'm going to put it in the S tier. It's not even a question. I love it, I love it, I love it. I think there's some weaker parts of the series, of course. Like anything else, it's not perfection. But I think it's really good. Alright, we've got Watchdog, and I forgot to put it on the list, but True Education. True Education is a great manhwa that should be checked out. True Education would have gone... Okay, so first, True Education. It's not here, but let me give you a quick beatdown. Main character... he's not even the main character. This teacher joins a school of troubled kids, basically, and he's brutal in his methods of correcting them. He comes from the government, so he kind of has some ways to get through. Really gives me great teacher Onizuka vibes without having the same layers of comedy and a bit more of that brutality that we see some of these Korean manhwas have. So True Education, I'd probably put it in the A tier of fighting manhwa. I think it's pretty good. Okay, Watch Dogs. Watch Dogs follows a protagonist that basically goes the route of like the only way to prevent shit from happening in my school is to become basically the big badass of my school, and rises the ranks and beats people down. The storyline wise, it's pretty good. Some good character interactions. It's fun. I think the art style lacks quite a bit. It's very stiff in its art style. It doesn't feel very fluid and movement based. It has an art style that you'll find in quite a bit of series, actually, just without the level of detail that you'll see in some other ones. The fights are pretty solid, and I think the story kind of melds well. So I'm going to finish and put it in the C tier. Guys, if you like this type of tier list on a specific type of manhwa, don't hesitate to leave a comment down below on the type of things you'd like me to do forward. I'd like to do a game system one. I think it would be an interesting tier list to make. Other than that, other types of contents you'd like to see me make on this channel, please don't hesitate to drop them down below. Please like and subscribe to the channel, and thanks for watching.